Former Health Minister Zweli Mkhize resigned before the president acted on an SIU report which implicated him in an illegal 266 million rand tender awarded, as you heard, to Digital Vibes. Well, in the briefing to Parliament yesterday, the SIU added Mkhize may have committed acts of criminality. Other officials in the department are also being investigated. Let's unpack the latest with Karam Singh. He's the head of investigations at Corruption Watch. Mr. Singh, yesterday in Parliament, we heard that the minister could be liable for criminal action. Take us forward. What happens now?
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult for us to comment as the public without having seen the full SIU report. So, I mean, the next thing that really must happen is that SIU report be made public. We're trying to piece together information based upon testimony at Parliament, based upon affidavits that have been issued in terms of the special tribunal. But it's important to remember that, you know, despite the extensive forensic capacity that the SIU has to investigate, that they don't have criminal jurisdiction to charge or prosecute. So that's obviously a handoff that happens now. So then the ball goes back into the MPA's court and the Hawks to see whether there are sufficient charges to proceed with criminal prosecutions in this matter.
What came out yesterday in Parliament was how senior health officials bent over backwards to try and ensure that Digital Vibes got the contract.
Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of classic now textbook case of tender rigging. We know that procurement fraud has really been the cornerstone of the corruption that we've seen over the PPE period. But let's go back. I mean, this story started with Peter Louis Myberg's investigations in the Daily Maverick. If those stories didn't break, would we ever have had this investigation? Would we have ever known these facts? And it's been slowly now coming out piece by piece. But in terms of our position as the public, we're still not seeing real transparency in this matter. And that's because of the limitations around the SIU's powers and the fact that they only can investigate with a proclamation and that their reports aren't instantaneously made public. So now it's June and we're still now waiting on the president to release the SIU report. So yeah, you know, it's not exactly a desirable state of affairs when it comes to thinking about how we engage in this fight against corruption.
Do you think Zweli Mkhize managed to avoid harsher sanction by resigning before this report actually came out?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, certainly his resignation, one of the things that the SIU can do is that they can recommend disciplinary action. They didn't have to do that because the minister has now stepped aside. So it's not clear that there's disciplinary action that can happen against him. But in terms of the potential criminal liability that he may have, that's still very much alive and well. And his step aside in terms of his political position shouldn't have an impact upon whether there's sufficient charges to really take that forward.
I think the only encouraging information that came out of yesterday's briefing was how Treasury at least tried to act as some kind of gatekeeper against the applied for deviation, and they actually tried to stop it.
You know, this is a really important issue, and I'm glad that you flagged it. It's something that Corruption Watch is trying to focus on in terms of our engagement about how do we monitor procurement. And there's two real areas where we see real red flags for potential corruption. And that's around these deviations and expansions in government contracts. And Treasury does release some information which allows us to track this. But really, when you begin to see these kind of seven-figure deviations and huge expansions to contracts. I mean, this in the case of Digital Vibes doing work that the GCIS should have been able to do in the first place. These are always serious red flags to potential corruption. So it's good that Treasury intervened there, and that's really Treasury exercising their constitutional and statutory mandate in terms of the PFMA and in terms of how procurement's supposed to function constitutionally.
Yeah, every single time I used to sit in Parliament, we used to go through a standing committee on public accounts on irregular expenditure. It was always when there's a state of emergency, for instance, a drought, and a minister needs to find 1 million bottles of water, and then there's this deviation, which is how the corruption wriggles in. And it sneaks its way in, and it just seems to always be that point, that state of disaster that we need to flag and look out for.
Absolutely, but I think there's even something more systemically troubling about the digital vibes story. And that's the fact that this is linked to the NHI, to National Health Insurance. You know, in order to provide health insurance, and this is now prior to the pandemic, government's going to have to mobilize significant amount of resources in order to provide that kind of benefit. And we can see at the inception of NHI that there were people at the highest levels within the Department of Health scheming about how they could skim money off of that program. And then they expanded that and they took advantage of the pandemic to then, you know, to expand, to try to expand and scheme more. So, you know, in these moments of our vulnerability and in this systemic issue of trying to provide the right to health care, we see officials within the state scheming about how they can steal those monies. And, you know, that's not just about emergency procurement. That goes fundamentally to how policy gets implemented and how opportunists see the opportunity to then loot. So that, I mean, that's very troubling.
It brings me to my last and broader question. You wonder how you get to know these politicians. They seem like decent human beings who have good intentions, and then they get involved or implicated in some corruption scheme, and you sit and wonder and you think, what happened? What went wrong? And the only conclusion I've come up with personally, and it's purely anecdotal, is that so many people are doing it that it feels like the rules don't apply and it's okay. Is anything you've managed to, have you ever thought about that?
You know, I mean, I think there are those issues around kind of an ethical lapse, and if others are doing it, then we can get away with it. I mean, there's always seemed to be this sense that you know, people that have even Jacob Zuma, you know, there seemed to be an element of his quiet defense that there were others involved in the arms deal, you know, that took money. Why is he the only one being prosecuted? But I mean, I think there are serious vulnerabilities within our system. And, you know, despite the great work of the SIU, despite the reinvigorated position of the MPA and the independent directorate, I don't think that we have an institutional response which is commensurate with the vulnerabilities within the system. So the system is vulnerable to corruption, and then people can exploit it, and they can do so in the shadow of state capture, saying that the institutions of state aren't going to be able to catch us. You know, they're not going to be able to do an investigation. If they prosecute us, we're going to be able to draw out this prosecution for as long as we can, and we'll never face charges. So, you know, that risk calculus that people take, you know, is related to the fact that they feel that they can exploit the system. So, you know, what we've been arguing for is a much stronger institutional response.
Thank you so much. That was Karam Singh from Corruption Watch.